What would you do if your HOA decided your farm was an eyesore and sent a fleet of surveillance drones to harass you? It started with a faint buzzing, like an angry mosquito that refused to die. I wiped the sweat off my brow and looked up from my tomato plants. There it was, black, sleek, hovering just above my field. Its tiny camera lens tilted downward, watching me like a nosy neighbor peeking over a fence. I frowned. A drone? Out here? Maybe some kid had lost control of their fancy gadget. Then another one appeared. And another. Within seconds, 4 more joined in, circling like mechanical vultures. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some random accident. I squinted, and that's when I saw it, the HOA logo plastered on the side. My hands clenched into fists. There was only one person insane enough to do this. Karen. Karen wasn't just your average HOA president, she was a tyrant in yoga pants, a walking neighborhood surveillance system with way too much free time and way too little common sense. She had a permanent scowl, a voice that could strip paint off a fence, and an ironclad belief that everyone should follow her rules. The only problem? I didn't live under her HOA's jurisdiction. That had never stopped her before. A week ago, she had left a note in my mailbox, written in her signature passive-aggressive cursive. Dear resident. The state of your property is concerning. HOA regulations must be upheld for community beautification. Please ensure your farm meets proper aesthetic standards. I had crumpled it and tossed it straight into the trash. Karen had no legal authority over my land. I figured she'd get bored and move on. I had underestimated her level of crazy. Now here she was, spying on me from above like some budget version of Big Brother. I planted my hands on my hips and glared at the drones. You've got to be kidding me. One of them tilted slightly, as if acknowledging my disbelief. That did it. I reached for a rock and lobbed it. The drone dodged effortlessly. The others hovered, their cameras zooming in. My blood boiled. This wasn't just annoying, it was a violation of privacy. I wasn't about to let her get away with this. Teeth clenched, I stomped toward the HOA office, a shiny little building that existed solely to house unnecessary rules and overpaid committee members. I didn't even make it inside before Karen stepped out onto the front porch, arms crossed, that infuriating smug look on her face. "Ah, Luke," she purred, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I was hoping you'd stop by." I knew that tone. She was enjoying this. She gestured toward the sky. "Have you seen our new HOA security drones? They're quite impressive, aren't they?" I scoffed. "Security? Karen, those things are spying on my farm." She waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Your property borders our community, and as HOA president, I have a duty to ensure everything follows aesthetic guidelines. We wouldn't want property values to drop, now would we?" I took a slow, deep breath. She was serious. I stared at her, trying to decide if she was delusional or just clinically insane. "Lady, I grow crops. Unless you have a personal problem with tomatoes, I don't see how this concerns you." Karen sighed dramatically, as if I was the unreasonable one. "It's not just the crops, Luke. It's the vibe of your farm. The equipment, the fencing, oh dear, those old tires by the barn. Simply unacceptable." I felt my eye twitch. "So let me get this straight. You think some tires on my own land are an eyesore, so you're sending drones to harass me?" "It's not harassment," she said sweetly. "It's compliance monitoring." I clenched my jaw. "Turn them off." She smiled, all innocence. "I'm afraid I can't do that. HOA policy." I took a deep breath, forcing myself not to yell. "Let me explain something to you, Karen. You don't own my land. You don't control what I do. And if those drones keep coming, they're going to start dropping out of the sky real fast. Her eyes narrowed. Are you threatening HOA property? I grinned. Nope. Just warning you. She huffed, spun on her heel, and marched back inside, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, fists clenched. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The drones didn't leave. If anything, they got bolder. By the time I made it back to my farmhouse, they were hovering even lower, barely 10 feet above my crops. Their little cameras zoomed in and out, adjusting like mechanical spies locked onto their target. Me. I grabbed a rock and lobbed it. The nearest drone twitched and effortlessly dodged, the rest of them hovering like smug little vultures. Karen wasn't just playing games. She was watching me. That night, I sat on my porch, arms crossed, glaring at the dark silhouettes of the drones blinking above my fields. This wasn't just about some HOA nonsense anymore. This was harassment. And I wasn't about to sit around and let some power-drunk suburban overlord treat my farm like her personal reality show. The next morning, I found an envelope taped to my mailbox. Thick, official-looking paper, HOA letterhead. I tore it open and scanned the contents. A fine. $5,000. For failure to comply with community aesthetic standards. My hands clenched the paper so tightly it nearly ripped. I wasn't even part of the HOA. I stormed down the road to Karen's pristine house, complete with freshly power-washed bricks and a perfectly symmetrical flower bed. I didn't even make it to her door before she stepped outside, smiling like she'd already won. "Oh, Luke," she said, mock surprise in her voice. "How unexpected." I held up the letter. "What the hell is this?" She glanced at it like she had no idea what I was talking about. "Oh, dear. That must be a mistake." She tilted her head. "Or perhaps the board decided your farm was causing visual distress to the neighborhood. After all, it does border our community." I stared at her. "I don't even live in your HOA." She let out a small, patronizing sigh, like I was a stubborn child who refused to eat his vegetables. "Technically, no. But your farm is adjacent to our neighborhood. And unfortunately, the site of your disorganized property affects community value." I stepped closer. "Let me make something very clear to you, Karen. You don't control my land, and I'm not paying a damn dime." She just smiled. "Well, that's your choice. Of course, unpaid fines tend to accumulate." I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. I turned on my heel and walked away, rage simmering in my chest. I needed a way to shut this down. Fast. So I called Hank. By the time I reached his property, the retired Air Force engineer was already waiting, a cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes crinkled in amusement. "Heard about your little drone problem," he said, shaking his head. "Karen's really lost it this time." "Tell me about it," I muttered. "Any chance you've got something that can take them down?" Hank let out a deep chuckle. "Those things are just off-the-shelf surveillance toys. Nothing fancy. You could knock 'em out with a rock if you were lucky." "Tried that," I said. "Didn't work." He scratched his chin, then his eyes lit up. "Ever hear of a signal jammer?" An hour later, I was back on my farm, standing in the middle of my field with a small black box the size of a shoebox. According to Hank, this little contraption would scramble the drone's signals within a set radius. The moment they tried to reconnect to their controller, poof, they'd drop out of the sky like busted kites. I flicked the switch and waited. The first drone wobbled. Then, with a pathetic sputter, it spiraled downward, crashing into the dirt. I grinned. The second one glitched mid-air, swerving violently before veering straight into my cornfield. The others fell like dominoes, one after the other. By the time the fifth one hit the ground, I was laughing so hard I had to wipe away tears. Karen's expensive little toys were officially out of commission. I cracked open a beer and leaned against my fence, admiring the pile of wreckage on my land. Then I heard the screech of tires. I turned to see Karen's SUV tearing down my driveway, kicking up dust. She climbed out, red-faced, phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. "You," she screeched. "You destroyed HOA property." I smirked, taking a slow sip of my beer. "You mean the illegal surveillance drones that were trespassing on my land?" "Yeah, they had a little malfunction." Her jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea how much those cost?" "Nope," I said, "and I don't care." Karen took a deep breath, visibly trying to contain her rage. "This isn't over. You'll be hearing from the HOA's legal team." I chuckled. "Good luck with that. Because last I checked, spying on private property is illegal." For the first time, Karen hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the pile of broken drones, then back to me. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out her next move. I smiled. Because I knew exactly what was coming next. Karen wasn't the type to give up. No, this was just the beginning. And if she wanted a war, I was more than ready to fight. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of knocking. Not a friendly tap, but the kind of sharp, authoritative pounding that meant one of two things: either someone was selling something I didn't want, or I was about to have a real bad day. I swung open the door and immediately frowned. Two men in khaki uniforms stood on my porch, clipboards in hand, badges gleaming. Animal control. The taller one, a guy with a graying mustache and tired eyes, gave me a look that said he wasn't happy to be here. "Morning. Got a complaint about neglected animals on your property." I blinked. "Excuse me?" He adjusted his clipboard. "Caller said your livestock are malnourished and living in unsanitary conditions. We need to inspect your property." I let out a slow breath, my jaw tightening. I already knew who had made that call. "Fine," I muttered, stepping aside. "Knock yourselves out." They followed me through the farm as I showed them every single animal, the chickens scratching happily in their coop, the pigs wallowing in fresh mud, the cows fat and content in the pasture. The inspectors barely had to check before realizing there was nothing wrong. The mustached one let out a sigh, rubbing his temple. "Yeah, this was a waste of time." I crossed my arms. "You don't say." He hesitated, flipping through his clipboard before pulling out the report. That's when I saw it. HOA branded letterhead. Karen's name. My hands clenched into fists. "Sorry about this," the guy muttered, stuffing the report back into his folder. "We get calls like this sometimes. Usually from some neighbor with a vendetta." "She's not my neighbor," I said, voice tight. "She's a damn dictator." They left soon after, shaking their heads, and I stood in my driveway watching them go, my pulse pounding with frustration. Karen wasn't just playing HOA queen anymore. She was weaponizing government agencies against me. I didn't have long to cool off before another problem landed on my doorstep. That night, as I sat on my porch drinking a well-earned beer, my phone buzzed with an email notification. At first, I thought it was another HOA fine. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. A court summons. I skimmed the document, my pulse hammering. Restraining order request. Filed by Karen Atkinson. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Unbelievable. The next morning, I found myself standing in a courthouse, staring across the room at Karen, who had gone full fragile suburban victim. She wore a perfectly pressed blazer, her expression one of manufactured distress. The judge, a balding man who looked like he had zero patience for nonsense, peered at Karen over his glasses. Ms. Atkinson, you're requesting a restraining order against Mr. Jacobson on what grounds? Karen took a theatrical breath. Your Honor, I have been the victim of relentless harassment. Mr. Jacobson has threatened me and engaged in dangerous cyber activities against the HOA. I rolled my eyes so hard I nearly saw the back of my skull. She pulled out a USB drive and handed it to the bailiff. Exhibit A, she announced dramatically. The screen flickered to life with edited drone footage, carefully cut to make me look like some unhinged lunatic. A clip of me throwing a rock, but not the part where the drone was trespassing. Footage of her drones falling, but edited to look like I had destroyed them maliciously. A shot of me confronting her at the HOA office, but not her smug provocations. The judge exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. Ms. Atkinson, do you have any unedited footage? Karen's smug expression faltered. Well, that's not relevant, Your Honor. What matters is that I feel. Feelings aren't evidence, the judge cut in, unimpressed. Mr. Jacobson, do you have a response? I smirked and held up my own flash drive. Yeah. Here's the real footage. A minute later, the screen played the unedited versions, showing exactly what had happened. Karen's face went pale. The judge sighed. Ms. Atkinson, this request is denied. Karen let out a strangled noise, but before she could argue, the judge slammed his gavel. I turned to her, grinning. Nice try. She glared daggers at me. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. That night, I spotted something new. 2 black SUVs parked at the edge of my property. Inside, men in tactical gear sat watching my farm. Not cops. Not HOA. Private security. Karen had hired a damn militia. I grabbed my phone and zoomed in. One of the men smirked, then turned to whisper something to his partner. I felt my fists clench. They weren't on my property. Not yet. But they were close enough to make a statement. I didn't need to ask who sent them. Karen had lost the court battle. So now, she was sending in the goons. From across the street, Karen's SUV pulled up. She rolled down the window, sipping some overpriced green juice, and waved at me like a queen greeting her peasants. I forced a smile and lifted my beer in a mock toast. Her eyes narrowed. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And neither was I. I didn't sleep much that night. Not with Karen's goons watching my farm like it was some kind of military operation. They didn't trespass, not yet, but they wanted me to know they were there. They wanted me to feel cornered. I refused to give them that satisfaction. By morning, I had a plan. I drove straight to Hank's workshop, my hands gripping the wheel tight. He was already outside, leaning against his truck, cigarette dangling from his lips. The moment he saw my face, he let out a low chuckle. Damn, he muttered. She escalated, huh? I nodded. She hired private security. They're parked near my land, watching me. Hank exhaled slowly, flicking ash onto the pavement. Karen's getting desperate. Means she knows she's losing. Maybe, I said. But I need to shut this down before she does something even worse. Hank pushed off his truck and smirked. Then I think it's time we stopped playing defense. He led me into his workshop, a cluttered paradise of tools, wires, and military-grade electronics that definitely shouldn't be in civilian hands. He reached up onto a high shelf and pulled down a small black case. This, he said, flipping it open, is how we turn the tables. Inside was a signal hijacker. Not just a jammer, a full remote takeover device. Instead of knocking drones out of the sky, this thing would let us control them. I grinned. An hour later, we had the device set up, calibrated, and ready to go. By the time the next drone appeared, we were waiting. It hovered just beyond my fence line, cautious, as if testing for interference. Another joined it. Then another. Karen had sent reinforcements. I flipped the switch. The first drone twitched. Then it spun in midair, shaking violently before suddenly reorienting, not toward my farm, but toward Karen's house. Hank let out a whistle. Damn. That worked fast. We watched through binoculars as the drone sped straight toward Karen's perfect backyard. It swooped down low, clipped one of her pristine garden gnomes, then knocked over a decorative lantern. Then it circled back. And this time, it went for the patio. Karen ran outside, screeching, her hands waving frantically. No, stop. But we weren't done. Hank made a quick adjustment, and the drone suddenly lurched toward her swimming pool. The moment it hit the water, the splash was glorious. Karen stood there, drenched, frozen in disbelief. Then she let out a blood-curdling scream. Hank doubled over laughing. Holy hell, I think she's about to explode. I barely had time to enjoy the moment before my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Sheriff Wilkins. I sighed, answering. Let me guess. She called you? A deep sigh on the other end. Luke, you wouldn't happen to know anything about a drone diving into Karen's pool, would you? I grinned. Nope. Must have had a malfunction. Another sigh. Look, I don't even want to deal with this mess. Just, try not to make it worse. No promises, I said, hanging up. But Karen had one more card to play. By the time I got home, sirens were blaring. 2 cop cars were parked in my driveway, and Karen stood beside them, arms crossed, a victorious smirk on her face. She looked like she had just won the damn lottery. I climbed out of my truck, shaking my head. Seriously? Deputy Wilkins gave me a tired look. Karen here says you hijacked an HOA security drone and crashed it into her property. I laughed. Oh, come on. Karen stepped forward, fake outrage dripping from her voice. This is destruction of private property, Deputy. He's engaging in cyber warfare. Wilkins pinched the bridge of his nose. Karen, for the last time, those drones were illegally surveilling private land. She gasped. It was for the good of the community. His farm is an eyesore. I was simply documenting his violations. I crossed my arms. Violations of what? Not planting tulips? Wilkins held up a hand. Karen, unless you've got actual proof of a crime, there's nothing we can do. Karen's smug expression faltered. But he. Nothing, Wilkins repeated, slower this time. Stop wasting police resources. Karen stood there, shaking with rage, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles turned white. I could see it, the moment she realized she had lost. For the first time, Karen had no comeback. Without another word, she spun on her heel, stormed to her car, and peeled out of my driveway so fast she nearly took out my mailbox. I exhaled, watching the dust settle. She's not done, Wilkins muttered. I cracked my knuckles. Neither am I. 4-0. For the first time in weeks, the sky above my farm was empty. No buzzing drones. No private security loitering at my fence line. No HOA letters shoved into my mailbox. Just silence. That should have been my first clue that Karen wasn't retreating, she was reloading. A week later, I found out exactly what she'd been up to. While she was busy throwing tantrums, I had been doing my own digging. It took some time, but with the right connections, I finally got my hands on something golden, the HOA's financial records. And just as I suspected, Karen had been funneling thousands of HOA dollars into her personal drone surveillance project. Not only that, but she had lied to the HOA board about where the money was going, disguising it as community security enhancements. Armed with irrefutable proof of her corruption, I did the one thing she never saw coming. I took it to the HOA board. At the next meeting, I stood in front of a packed room, my evidence in hand. The moment I presented the receipts, the budgets, and the outright fraud, the entire board turned on her like a pack of hungry wolves. Karen's face went pale as the realization hit. She stammered, tried to deny it, then tried to blame the accountant. When that didn't work, she claimed it was for the good of the community. But it was too late. By a unanimous vote, Karen was removed as HOA president. And just like that, her reign of terror was over. But the best part? She was broke. After her removal, the HOA demanded repayment for every cent she had misused. Unable to pay, Karen was forced to sell her house and leave the neighborhood entirely. A month later, I saw a familiar, for auction, sign outside her once perfect home. And I did the only reasonable thing. I bought it. But I didn't move in. Oh no. Instead, I turned it into a farm supply store. We hung up a big, bold sign right out front. Karen's Exile Feed and Supply. Every time I walk past it, I smile. Because in the end, she lost everything, and I got the last laugh. And now, I have to ask, have you ever fought back against HOA tyranny? Or better yet, a Karen? Share your war stories below, let's see who had it worse.